The Admiral mocked the cadet, but the deep void navigators knew better. The Admiral paused in front of me, and the bridge went silent the way a bridge goes silent when it's already reached its verdict. She was veil-hoary, sharp-boned, luminescent at the joints, the product of so many generations of deliberate genetic refinement that what her species called impressive had become anatomical, a fact of structure rather than a quality of the individual. She looked past my right shoulder at something she found more worth addressing than my face. "This one," she said to the fleet registrar at her left, "is a joke the selection board is still writing the punchline to." I drank my tea. Laughter moved through the officer tier like a current that understood its purpose. The people laughing knew what the laugh was for. They produced it efficiently and released it. I drank more tea. The fleet command station on Veilhari Prime had been constructed for moments exactly like this one, 50 meters of reinforced alloy above my head. The registry of every civilization the fleet had ever conscripted carved into the overhead paneling in lettering fine enough to demand real effort to decipher. The illumination came from sources you could not locate, precise, angled, arranged in particular manner of light designed to make everything beneath it look like it was being evaluated. The floor was polished obsidian composite. The walls matched. The entire space was a closed system engineered to reduce anything standing inside it to a manageable scale. I had been in narrower corridors that felt wider. The architecture was doing its intended work on everyone else. There were 9 of us in the cadet cohort, 7 civilizations, 9 individuals, each one selected because they represented something quantifiable and meaningful about their kind. The Dharavi male 4 positions to my right stood nearly 5 meters tall and carried the weight of 12 generations of distinguished fleet-adjacent service, the way large structures carry load, without thinking about it, without needing to. His intake file ran to 3 full pages of lineage history before it arrived at his personal qualification. The Mirhari female across the corridor had 4 separate cranial structures nested concentrically, each housing its own cognitive architecture, each running its own analytical frequency in parallel. She could process 4 simultaneous tactical evaluations that would require most species 4 separate sessions to complete. Right now, one set of her eyes tracked the register. One set moved between the other cadets. A third set was aimed at the overhead paneling in a direction, suggesting she was somewhere more productive entirely. The fourth remained still in a way that implied it was listening to something the rest of the room could not hear. The mirror twin stood at the far right end of the row, 2 frames sharing one distributed consciousness, breathing in matched rhythm, moving with the eerie coordination of organisms that process the world at double the rate of most of what they encounter. Watching them stand at attention was like watching a single mind practice stillness across 2 bodies. I had a tea flask, a transit pack, and a scholarship that had required 7 years of disputed committee deliberation to produce. I had found the record of that deliberation in the fleet's open archive the evening before reporting in. It was filed beneath 4 layers of administrative subcategories, which told me something about how the fleet regarded the outcome. The relevant notation was 7 years old and 4 sentences long. The first sentence stated that my spatial pattern analysis scores placed in the upper 1 percentile of all civilizations tested across the last 50 years of fleet admissions. The second recommended my acceptance. The third acknowledged the committee deliberation would be contested. The fourth contained a word I did not have a direct translation for, which told me something too. Admiral Valen had moved on down the cadet row. I watched her work through the remaining 8 with the practiced ease of someone who understood the ceremonial requirements of this moment and intended to fulfill them correctly. Formal recognitions, precisely calibrated acknowledgments, the register of a patron who had sponsored fleet cadets before and knew the expected script. She said something about the Dharavi male's family contributions to fleet cartography. He straightened to his full height. She moved to the Mirhari female and said something about her civilization's enrollment record across 4 previous intake cycles. All 4 sets of eyes dipped in sequence. She found something appropriate for each of them. Then she passed me without adding anything further. I stood there with a flask warm in my hands and the fading laughter still present in the air, and I thought about the fact that I was the first Terran who had ever been admitted to this fleet program. Not the first to apply. There had been others across the years, in various branches, various intake cycles. Some had qualified on documentation. Some had reached further than documentation. None had reached this corridor. I was in this corridor. That was a fact independent of anything the Admiral thought about it. At the far wall, 6 figures stood apart from the proceedings, a way of fixed points of room has grown around and stopped attempting to rearrange. The Deep Void Navigators, the fleet's ranking active field team. Combined, they carried over 900 years of operational navigation experience across 16 systems. They did not run orientation sessions. They did not attend intake evaluation. Their presence here today had been unusual enough that 2 fleet staff members had discussed it in the access corridor outside, neither of them speaking at a volume that suggested awareness of acoustic. I had read everything publicly accessible about each of them during the transit over. Kareth was the oldest, and the one most of the available records concerned. One hand replaced below the wrist with a dense lattice of field-scarred alloy, built like something that had once been significantly larger in an earlier configuration and had compressed itself into something more efficient through sheer accumulated application. His service record in the Fleet Archive extended to 47 pages and covered active operations in 13 separate systems. He was the fleet's most experienced active navigator by every metric the records contained. He was looking at me, not at the corridor in general, not at Valen or the proceedings or the registrar, at me specifically, with a flat and deliberate focus of someone who has decided a thing is worth observing and sees no reason to conceal that decision. I held the contact for a moment. Then I looked at my tea. I did not know what he was reading in me. I knew what I had been doing in this corridor since I entered it, counting the access points, mapping the panel seams, identifying a section of wall behind the registrar station where the replacement cladding did not align with the original material by 3 millimeters and a shade of gray someone had judged too quickly. 3 exits, 2 marked, 1 behind replacement paneling installed after original construction, not matched well enough to evade the attention of someone who looked for that kind of thing. I count exit. I drink tea. The 2 habits arrived together on the same day 4 years ago, and I have never attempted to separate them. The 4 remaining navigators stood alongside Kareth without speaking. The youngest among them, compact, quick-eyed, carrying 160 years of service in a frame that still appeared relatively recent, was named SIV. She had been watching proceedings with the particular attention of someone who has been directed to observe something but has not yet been told the reason. The intake proceedings moved through their standard sequence. Fleet registrars covered the assessment schedule, the first trial date, the ranking criteria, the conduct protocols. I listened to what I needed and spent the remainder watching the corridor. Dorith, the Daravi male, was angling his shoulders to maximize his visible breadth, which told me the assurances file was compensating for something less certain underneath. The Mirhuri female directed a question at the registrar that required 3 translation matrices to render into an answerable form. The Mirror twins observed me for most of the session. I noted that and filed it. As the group began moving toward the designated meal assembly, I turned the small piece of alloy over inside my jacket pocket, dark gray, roughly the length of my thumb, old stress fracturing along one edge where something had struck it with enough force to deform the surface without breaking through. I had been carrying it for 4 years. I had retrieved it on the 9th day. I do not speak about what came before the 9th day. Kareth shifted his weight, just that single degree, barely perceptible in the general direction of my position. The weight adjustment of someone confirming a thing they had been 85% certain of and were now fully certain of. Like a navigator who has just recognized a landmark. I went to locate a quiet alcove to finish my tea. That night, alone in the quarters assigned to me, compact, functional, a viewport facing the equipment bay and a structural strut I could not identify by class. I sat on the edge of bunk and turned the alloy piece over my palm. Small and dark and worn, smooth from handling. Outside, high along the upper maintenance scaffold, something small pressed itself against the conduit and did not move, watching through the viewport. I watched back. After a while, it left. I remained where I was. I thought about what it meant to be the first Terran, in this corridor, in this program, in this station. Not what it meant to anyone else. Just what it meant as a fact sitting in the record, independent of commentary. 1 out of 1. I put the alloy away, finished the last of my tea, and lay back studying the plain alloy's ceiling until I was ready to sleep. The Gravok was not a juvenile, whatever the catalog record had indicated. Whoever had made the original classification, they had been wrong in the specific and consequential way that wrong becomes when it concerns a creature whose secondary strike structure adds 40 centimeters of reach behind its primary attack, and whose displacement runs 250 kilograms past what the file suggested. It emerged from the western quadrant of the trial basin, not the southern access corridor where the approach signatures had been recorded, which told me 2 things in the same instant. The signatures near the entry point were old. This creature had already repositioned since making them. It had been monitoring the basin before any of us arrived. I was positioned on a structural ledge 8 meters above the basin floor. I had been there since 30 seconds after the Gravok appeared. Not out of alarm, because I was counting. The trial terrain was a 4-kilometer basin on the outer perimeter of Veilhari Prime second landmass, selected for its controlled access corridors and what the pre-mission documentation had described as contained topography. We had been deployed with standard equipment, tracking arrays, restraint lines, a sedative applicator rated for organisms up to 1,000 kilograms. The catalog entry had listed the target at 430 kilograms. The pressure signatures near the entry corridor suggested over 650. I had examined the signature, examined the sedative applicator in my hand, and climbed the ledge. Below me, the cohort was advancing in the formation the fleet documentation had recommended. Dorothy led from the front with the complete assurance of someone for whom the distance between confidence and capability had never been a problem worth considering. The Mirhari female was moving the left flank, processing terrain across 4 simultaneous frequencies. The Mirror twins held the right in their unnerving synchronized advance. The other cadets moved through the center. The Gravok appeared and assessed the group. Then it moved. Dorothy had the right instinct. Advance directly, apply mass advantage, establish positioning before the creature could. It was the correct approach for the organism in the catalog record. The organism in the basin outweighed him by 280 kilograms and used its flank instead of meeting him at the front. Dorothy went 35 meters into the western embankment. He did not rise immediately. I checked the angle from the ledge. He was alive. I confirmed it and returned my attention to the Gravok. The Mirhari female executed a mathematically optimal approach pattern. She constructed it across 4 cognitive frequencies in under 2 seconds, which was genuinely remarkable. The pattern was optimal for the catalog organism. The organism in the basin exceeded the pattern's assumptions in the 3rd second of engagement. She read the failure in real time, recalculated the revised risk assessment, and withdrew to safe distance. Correct judgment, incorrect data. The Mirror twins executed a coordinated flanking approach that would have been nearly elegant against the catalog target. The creature broke the flanking geometry in 2 movements and drove them both toward the northern embankment, where they stopped and held position with the careful restraint of things that had recalculated and determined that patience was now the correct strategy. The remaining cadets arrived at the same conclusion the Mirhari female had reached. They withdrew. I sat on the ledge and counted. Blink rate irregular, averaging once per 5 seconds. High focus state, not resting. Weight distribution shifted toward the right front limb by approximately 20%, compensating an older damage point on the left, healed improperly. Functional, but not its preferred load side. Breath pattern steady, the measured respiration of something that was not concerned by what was in the basin with it. It was not concerned by what was in the basin with it. It scanned, assessed the regrouping cadets, assessed the embankment where Dorothy had landed, assessed the open terrain. Then it looked at the structural edge. It looked at me. I held still. It looked at me for 42 seconds. I counted every one. Then it looked away. I had 38 seconds before it turned back toward the Mirror twins at the embankment. My approach had a 55% probability of success by generous calculation, no particular elegance, and was going to cost me 1 boot somewhere in the middle phase. I had run the geometry 4 times during the counting and arrived at the same 55% each time. I came off the ledge. The restraint line found anchor in the Gravaka's upper right shoulder structure. The sedative applicator required 4 deployment points rather than 1, because a single point would not produce the necessary saturation rate in the available time for a creature of this mass. I lost the boot when the Gravok pivoted attempting to reach me with its primary strike, and I pivoted with it, and the basin floor arrived faster than the geometry had accounted for. The Gravok went down at the 98-second mark. I sat on the basin floor, beside it, 1 boot present, 1 boot somewhere in the western terrain, breathing at a rate I would not have chosen voluntarily. A new line of impact damage across my shoulder that was going to need attention, and that I was currently cataloging by sensation, because examining it directly was not a priority. The basin was quiet. Then the observation platform's communication channel opened. Admiral Valen's voice came through with the careful precision of someone who has decided to be accurate. Reckless, she said. Unrefined. It survived by fortune. She said it, not he. I looked at the unconscious Gravok for a moment. Yeah, I said to nobody in particular. Hell of a thing. The medical extraction team arrived 11 minutes later. The lead medic was a man named Orov. Efficient movement, professional steadiness, the specific quality of someone who had been sealing field injuries for 2 decades and had long since stopped being surprised by what people came back resembling. He took one look at my shoulder, gave me a look in return that said he had encountered worse and did not particularly want to keep encountering it, and guided me toward the extraction unit. 3 hours later, in the fleet's review chamber, the mission footage ran on a wall display. The operations analyst walked the cohort through the event sequence with technical precision. Each cadet's decisions, their outcomes, the tactical variables at each stage, professional register, assessment rather than verdict. When the footage reached my section, the analyst paused it. Kareth was in the chamber. He had not been present for the start of the review. He had arrived partway through and was standing against the rear wall beside SIV, who was watching the display with the expression of someone working through a problem they had not yet fully named. Kareth said something to her. Low. I could not catch it through the chamber's ambient noise. He was indicating the timestamp on the frozen image. SIV studied the timestamp, looked at Kareth, replied. Kareth responded in one sentence and walked out. I learned later what he had said from a fleet staff member who mentioned it the way people mention things they know they should not mention, quickly, without quite making direct contact. Kareth had indicated my timestamp and said, count those seconds. SIV had counted 42 seconds on the ledge, while the Gravok was processing the other cadets below. She had noted that the creature had not advanced on the ledge during those 42 seconds, that it had looked up at me and then looked elsewhere. Kareth had said, Prey does not receive 40 seconds. Prey receives 0. That creature looked at the Terran and could not file what it was observing. Do you know what requires 40 seconds to process? He had walked out before SIV answered. I was in the medical bay when this was relayed to me. Aura was finishing the work on my shoulder with the focused attention he applied to everything. Does this require anything for discomfort? He asked. I've been worse, I said. I said it the way a thing gets said when it has been said enough times to wear smooth. He did not ask again. Admiral Valen filed the capacity. Dispute 6 days after the first trial. Clean documentation. Procedurally correct on every point. Patron right of review. Standard clause, the kind of motion the fleet's own protocols existed to accommodate. The argument was direct. The cadet in intake position 9 had demonstrated unpredictable field behavior, generated material risk for the other cohort members, and represented an ongoing liability concern for the patron's investment in the program. She was not factually incorrect on any of those points. She was making the wrong argument with accurate evidence. The fleet convened a formal review. Valen attended in person, which told me how seriously she was treating the outcome. The 6 Deep Void navigators were not required to be present. They were not on the review board. Their attendance was not part of the process. Kareth entered anyway. He entered alone, sat without being invited, closed the access panel behind him, and remained inside for 14 minutes. I know it was 14 minutes because I was in the access corridor outside, sitting against the wall with my tea flask, with the particular patience of someone who has learned that waiting is not equivalent to losing, and I counted. Kareth came out. He walked past me without a look in either direction. The capacity dispute was tabled pending secondary review in Fleet Procedural Register. That meant it would not be revisited without substantial new cause. I finished my tea. I went to the training deck and ran the assessment circuit. The circuit was 2 kilometers of variable terrain, elevation transitions, structural traverses, grip sequences for time segments with sensor-gated checkpoints. The fleet's standard expectation was 1 completion per daily training session. I had been running it 5 times each morning since arriving, not because anyone had directed me to, because the circuit had 13 distinct segments, and I had identified a timing gap in one of them, a 2-second interval between the sensor resets in the 5th segment where the expected completion time could be reduced by a specific route variation, and I was curious how long it would take to locate the equivalent gap in the other 12. I had found 10 of the 13 by that morning. I was on my 4th run when Kareth arrived at the circuit perimeter. He stood and watched me complete the segment I was in. I came down from the upper traverse, landed on the flat surface, and moved toward the next obstacle. You're going to fracture your shoulder assembly, he said. Already did, I said. Other one. Stop. I stopped. He stood in front of me the way substantial things stand when they are not making an effort to be imposing and simply exist that way by nature. He studied the circuit for a moment, then studied me. In 230 years of active field navigation, he said, I have worked alongside 3 Terrans. I waited. Not your general classification, he said. Not bipedal oxygen processing, specifically Terran. Your world, your strain. He was quiet in the way of someone selecting what to say rather than deciding whether to say it. You are not the strongest thing I have worked alongside, he said. Not the fastest. Your sensory range falls below average for the civilizations this fleet regularly operates with. Your physical recovery time exceeds 6 of the other 8 cadets currently in this intake cohort. Not exactly an endorsement, I said. The Gravok could not categorize you, he said. You understand what that means. I looked at my hands. It means it observed me and could not determine whether I was prey or something else. I said, or something else, he said carefully. He sat across from me in the deliberate manner of someone who has decided this will require time and wants to be settled for it. The galaxy's taxonomy of living things, he said, is old and thorough. Predators, prey, scavengers, and parasites. The rare apex of apex organisms that the fleet kept lengthy records on and brief survival accounts of. These categories have been sufficient for 450 years of organized navigation across 4 dozen documented systems. Every creature the fleet had ever encountered had fit somewhere within the structure. He paused. Almost every creature. There was a classification the standard taxonomy did not have a clean entry for, not because it was rare in numerical terms, because it broke the category structure at its foundation. It was not born dangerous. It had not been bred dangerous. It had not evolved into a position at the summit of any natural hierarchy through the slow mechanism of selection pressure applied across millions of years. It had chosen, not in a single moment, not through one defining decision that had made it something new. Every day, repeatedly, against every biological signal that said stop, withdraw, locate the position of lowest exposure, preserve, find safety. Against all of that, it had made the same choice until the choice had become the creature. The things that hunted by instinct, by taxonomy, by the inherited categories their civilizations had constructed across evolutionary history. When they encountered this type, something in their processing stalled, because it did not fit the category, because their classifications had no file for a thing that chose to be dangerous. That stall was a 42 seconds. You're describing what I am, I said. I'm describing what the Gravok perceived, he said. Same thing. He said nothing. I turned the alloy piece over inside my pocket. 9 days, I said. Dorothi border sector. You know that territory. He was quiet. A breeding cluster, I said. Active cycle. 14 adults, 6 juveniles. I returned the alloy to my pocket. I've been worse, I said. I got up and returned to the circuit. He did not stop me. He sat where he was. I heard him rise eventually, somewhere during my 5th run, and exit the deck through the east access. I completed the final 3 segments and located both of the timing gaps I had been missing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That afternoon, the cadet cohort assembled for a tactical review session in the main operations hall. I sat at the rear and observed the room, at least as much as a display board. Dorothy had recovered from the first trial with 2 stress fractures that the medical team had addressed within 2 days and a fractured confidence that was taking longer. The Mirhari female had reconstructed her behavioral model for Gravok-class organisms from the beginning, incorporating every data point from the first trial, and produced a revised assessment document that was technically outstanding. The mirror twins approached me after the session concluded, when the cohort was dispersing. The left one said, "We reviewed the mission footage 5 times. What did you find?" I asked. They exchanged a glance. The synchronized look of 2 people who share a consciousness and are experiencing the same uncertainty simultaneously. The right one said, "The creature had at least 4 clear opportunities to advance on your ledge position." 5, I said. There were 5. They looked at me. None of the 5 had been taken. The left one said, "Why not?" I picked up my pack. "Good question," I said. "Let me know when you work it out. I want to find more tea." That night in my quarters, I turned the alloy over my palm and considered Karatha's words, not the specific ones, the shape of what they accumulated to. Chose dangerous. The galaxy had many architectures of danger: physical force, speed, collective numbers, toxicity, coordinated cognition, the layered advantages accumulated through millions of years of natural selection, each civilization sharpened by the slow mechanism of what survived and what did not. That mechanism produced a Gravok. The mirror twins shared consciousness, Dorotha's mass density. Then there was the kind that woke up every cycle and made a decision. I thought about whether that was a good thing to be for a long time. I did not arrive at a clean conclusion. I put the alloy in my pocket and went to sleep. The mission documentation said, Vorachai, distributed hunter, average cluster size 11 to 15 individual, successfully manage and control conditions with a full navigator team 14 times in the past 45 years. No confirmed solo neutralization on record. Threat assessment, high moderate, applicable to a full navigator team, which meant the rating for cadets in non-engagement observer roles was effectively theoretical. The Vorachai was not a cluster. We were 27 minutes into the active phase when Karatha's voice came through the communication channel with a particular register of someone recalibrating a situation they have just classified incorrectly. The target, he said, is not a cluster. A pause. It is a colony. A cluster was a group of individual organisms coordinating behavior through signaling. A colony was a distributed single organism, one neural network extended across multiple frames, each unit functioning as a node in a single unified consciousness, every node processing and responding as part of one system. No signaling delay between members, no individual decision point, one mind, 27 bodies. The distinction was significant. The distinction meant the sedative strategy built on individual dosing was useless. The containment model built on isolating and separating individuals was useless. The entire mission plan had been constructed for a cluster, and we were in a basin with a colony. And the two situations required approaches so fundamentally different that nothing currently in anyone's hands applied. It also meant the threat assessment of high moderate required immediate revision upward. The basin had 4 observation platforms. Admiral Valen was on the central platform with her 2 staff and the fleet's senior coordination officer. The platform was elevated 50 meters above the basin floor. The pre-mission documentation had described its impact tolerance with a term I could not now recall precisely, but that had sounded adequately robust at the time. 27 nodes coordinating a single action through one distributed consciousness were not a standard impact scenario. The central platform absorbed a pressure wave strike at the 28-second mark following Karatha's notification. 3 of the colony's nodes had redirected their trajectories simultaneously toward the platform's structural base, not a direct strike, but a coordinated force event that the platform's primary structure absorbed and its upper observation module did not. The module separated from its mount. It descended 230 meters into the basin interior. I know that distance because I was already moving before it landed, and I measured the interval between my position and the impact point as I ran. The navigators were repositioning. Karat directing the nearest 3 toward the colony's primary node cluster, the others cutting the secondary movement corridor. The approach was correct for the recalibrated situation. It was the right tactical choice. It left a gap at the impact site. I was the only thing in range of that gap. I have considered many times since what occurred in the seconds after I registered that fact, and I cannot produce a coherent account of a decision being made. There was no moment where I assessed alternatives, weighed the rational variables, selected the most defensible course. There was simply a gap, a location, and my feet already in motion toward it. Toward it, not away. I have understood for some time that this is how I function. It is not a thing I selected in any single defining moment. It is the accumulated result of a large number of smaller choices made over an extended period until the direction of motion stopped being a choice and became the automatic answer to a gap. The basin floor was broken terrain. The colony had moved through it and left evidence. Deep impression marks, scattered equipment containers from the early deployment, struck and distributed across a 60-meter radius. I ran the broken terrain at the pace the surface allowed, which was not swift, and tracked the colony's node positions from the communication signals reaching my unit, mapping them against my route in real time. 9 nodes stood between me and the impact site. 6 were engaged with the navigators at the containment perimeter. 3 were not engaged. The 3 unengaged nodes were moving in a direction that intersected my route at approximately the 240-meter mark. I adjusted my route. The new line added 50 meters and passed through the worst section of the broken terrain. I ran it anyway. The colony was one organism processing through 27 frames. When some portion of its consciousness registered the Terran moving through the lower basin, I know it did, because of what happened next. It ran into the same problem Gravok had encountered in the trial basin 3 weeks earlier. The three unengaged nodes decelerated, not stopped, decelerated. 4 full seconds of the colony performing the computational equivalent of re-examining a classification it lacked confidence in, redirecting processing to evaluate an input for which it had no clean category. I did not wait for the 4 seconds to resolve. The impact site was the remains of the observation module, a roughly rectangular debris field 11 meters across, one intact and angled against a rock outcropping where the impact had driven it, the opposite end open. I found Admiral Valen in an intact section, conscious, bleeding from a cut along the left temple, veil Hari iridescence from the bone structure catching the midday light in a way that had nothing to do with the current situation, which I noted and set aside. One hand braced against the interior wall, seated upright, spine functional. She looked at me. I checked the node positions on my communication unit. Can you move? I said, yes. The intact section has better structural rating. We remain in it. Can you walk? Yes. Then move to the rear corner and stay low. She moved to the rear corner and stayed low. I positioned myself at the open end of the module wreckage, where the structure provided partial cover and a clear view of the approach terrain. The colony's nearest nodes were 41 meters out. The 6 engaged nodes were still occupied at the containment perimeter. The 3 that had decelerated were now stationary. They were oriented in my direction. I observed them. 41, 40, 39. The colony's 6 engaged nodes were beginning to press against containment perimeter with increasing force. The navigators were managing it, but 6 individuals against 21 active nodes of a single distributed consciousness was a calculation that was not going to hold indefinitely. I watched the 3 stationary nodes. 32 seconds. 1 organism. 1 neural network. What registered in one node registered across all 27 simultaneously. That was a feature that made a colony categorically more dangerous than a cluster. Coordinated response at the speed of cognition. No delay. No individual hesitation. No interval between decision and execution across the entire system. It was also, under specific conditions, a vulnerability. Distraction at scale. I picked up the restraint line, oriented it toward the largest of 3 stationary nodes, and ran directly at it. What I intended to do when I reached it was not fully resolved when I started running. I had the general architecture of the approach and the specific understanding that if the colony's entire distributed consciousness was processing a single unexpected input, a Terran running at full speed directly at a stationary node, it would redirect processing from the engagement perimeter. It redirected processing from the engagement perimeter. I felt the shift in the colony's attention more than I saw it. The 3 stationary nodes all oriented fully toward me. Every other node in the basin fractionally slowed, fractionally redirected some portion of their processing, the way 27 components of one consciousness all turn when something unanticipated enters their shared perceptual field. Kareth used that interval. The restraint line found anchor on the node's rear structural junction. The sedative applicator was individually rated against a single node's isolated mass, which was a fraction of the colony's total biology, which meant the dosage produced a disproportionate local effect even while doing nothing meaningful to the colony's core consciousness. The node went down. The colony experienced that loss across every frame it occupied simultaneously. Whatever the navigators accomplished in the 9 minutes following, I am the wrong perspective to describe accurately. I was positioned behind the rock outcropping beside the intact end of the module wreckage. Valen was 4 meters to my left. I tracked the engagement through the gap between 2 rock formations and monitored node positions on my communication unit until the basin went quiet. The basin went quiet. I sat down against the rock face and studied the debris distributed across the ground ahead of me and noted with quiet and genuine appreciation that I still had both boots. I considered that a material improvement. Valen came and sat near me, not beside me, a measured interval, a deliberate placement, close enough that the distance was a choice rather than an accident. She looked at the debris field. Then she looked at me. I opened my tea flask, still warm. This occurred more often than probability suggested, and I had long since stopped examining it. You came, she said. She said it the way you say something when the model you have been running does not balance, and you are examining the proof of your own error. You were in range. I said. I drank my tea. I had the alloy piece in my left hand, without remembering retrieving it. I turned it over twice and returned it to my pocket. Kareth found us 9 minutes later. He looked at the debris. He looked at Valen. He looked at me. Both boots, he said. Both boots, I confirmed. He produced a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was a near relation to one. He walked away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The 10 days following the basin engagement were unusual in the particular way of things that have shifted without formally announcing the change. The evaluation program continued on schedule. Training sessions ran. The ranking criteria remained unaltered. The intake cycle proceeded according to its standard structure, and on documentation, nothing about it differed from our arrival day. But the corridor had a different temperature. Doris stopped standing 4 positions away from me at intake briefings and began positioning himself 2 positions over. Not a large shift. The shift of a thing that has received new information and quietly updated its assessment of what is worth standing near. The Mirhuri female added a 5th analytical framework to her assessment models and labeled it. I discovered this from SIV, who had observed her documentation during a review session with a notation that translated approximately as behavioral exception, Terran non-standard threat profile. She was constructing a model. I was the subject of the model. The mirror twin stopped observing me from across the corridor and began sitting closer. Neither of them mentioned the chain. Neither did I. No one said anything about any of it. The corridor simply rearranged itself around a new understanding of what was in it. The way spaces do when they have received information they cannot unreceive. Valen attended the post-mission review on the 4th day following the basin engagement. She was required to attend. Patron protocol applied whenever a patron-sponsored participant had been in direct contact with the primary mission threat. She sat in the frontier with her fleet coordination officer and observed the operations analysts work through the engagement sequence. When the footage reached the lower basin section, the impact, the gap, the run, she observed it without visible expression. When the footage reached the section where I was running at the colony node with a restraint line and an individual dose sedative applicator, she observed that without expression as well. Afterward, the fleet coordination officer brought the required incident documentation for patron signature, standard administrative closure of the mission record. She read it with the attention of someone who reads everything before committing to it. She signed it. She said nothing to me during the review. On her way out of the chamber, she looked at me once, direct contact, unhurried, before continuing on. I did not have the right category for that look. It was not warmth. It was not apology. It was something older than both. The specific expression of someone who has been substantially wrong about something they were substantially confident in, who is still in the early stages of running the full implications of that. I let it be what it was. The fleet's formal review of my field performance in the basin engagement ran concurrently with a standard post-mission assessment cycle. I was not included in the review process. I discovered it had been convened from Orav, who had developed a professional habit of sharing information he was not technically authorized to share while appearing entirely absorbed in whatever medical task occupied his hands at the moment. He told me the review board had been convened at the request of 2 individuals. He did not provide names. He told me it had run for 5 hours. He told me the outcome had not been formally announced internally and that, based on the procedural register he had observed in the administrative system, it probably would not be communicated through standard channels. How are you managing with all of it? He asked, checking the healing progress on my shoulder with the focused attention of someone not asking a medical question. I've been worse, I said. He looked up briefly. You say that frequently, he said. It's frequently accurate, I said. He finished his work and left. I went to the training deck and ran the assessment circuit. The fleet's formal elevation process had a precise and unambiguous structure. A cadet who demonstrated navigator equivalent performance in an active field engagement could be recommended for early elevation by a ranking deep void navigator. The recommendation required endorsement from a minimum of 4 additional navigators. The fleet registrar confirmed the recommendation through a verification process. The entire procedure was, by institutional tradition, quiet. No theatrical announcement. No public ceremony beyond what the formal record required. A notation in the file. A marker placed by the ranking navigator. A status change recorded with the same professional brevity as any other administrative action. I was informed on a Thursday morning. Orav contacted my quarters before the training day's first session and said, with a careful expression of someone delivering information they had been asked not to deliver and had decided to deliver regardless, they want you in the formal hall at the 8th hour. I was there at the 8th hour. The formal hall was smaller than the intake corridor, though constructed according to the same architectural principle. High alloy ceiling, deliberate illumination. The space is a closed system designed to give weight to what occurred inside it. The hall held the 6 deep void navigators standing at the front, the fleet registrar at the record station, Admiral Valen at the patron position on the right side of the hall, and the 9 cadets. The others had been given no specific information. They entered with a composed awareness of people who understood they were observing something procedurally unusual without yet being able to name it. Doris stood straight. The mirrory female had all 5 cognitive systems oriented at the same focal point. The mirror twins were not in perfect synchronization for the first time since I had met them, each of them doing slightly different things with their hands, which indicated they were processing this moment individually rather than collectively. I noted that and moved to the back of the hall. Kara stood at the front. He did not begin with a statement. He did not explain what was occurring or why. He stood before the fleet registrar, retrieved a formal elevation marker, a metal disc, restrained in scale, the fleet's ranking inscription on one face, and walked the back of the hall where I was standing. He placed it in my palm. The other 5 navigators remained where they were. None of them spoke. None of them moved. The registrar read the notation from the official record. Standard ceremonial language, the kind that has been applied to the same purpose so many times that all personal weight has been replaced with institutional weight, which is in its way heavier. I stood there at the marker in my hand and looked at the hall. Dorothy was watching me with the direct attention of someone who had finished recalibrating and arrived at a stable conclusion he intended to hold. The mirrory female had all 5 cognitive systems oriented toward me, all 5 analytical frameworks converging on one focal point, which I understood to be significant. Valen was watching me from the patron position. She had been watching me since I entered. I returned the alloy piece to my pocket before anyone could ask about it. Kareth returned to the front. The registrar closed the record. The hall dispersed. In the access corridor outside, Valen came to me. Her fleet coordination officer maintained a respectful interval with the practiced discretion of someone who understood when their presence was not part of what was occurring. She stood in front of me, not past my shoulder at me. I had prepared something to say in there, she said. Formal recognition, the appropriate register for this kind of occasion. She stopped. I did not say it, she said. I waited. She looked at my pocket, the one where the alloy piece lived. You had that in the basin, she said. You returned it to your pocket before you ran at the node. I remember. She was quiet. I have been patron to this fleet program for 16 years, she said. I have sponsored 4 full intake cycles. I have observed cadets from civilizations whose physical capabilities exist in ranges your biology cannot approach. She looked at me directly. I have never observed something run at a colony node with a restraint line and an individual dose sedative applicator. There was a gap, I said. You were in it. That is not an explanation. No, I said, it is not. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not empty. I was wrong, she said. 3 words, left standing on their own without supplement. I nodded. She returned to her coordination officer and left the corridor. I stood there for a moment with a marker in one hand and my tea flask in the other. Then I went to find Kareth. He was in a small observation alcove at the station's upper level, the one oriented outward past the station's outer lighting array to the dark beyond, standing with his hands behind his back, looking at the space between the stars. He did not turn when I entered. I stood beside him and looked at the same dark. She apologized. I said, what did she say? That she was wrong. He produced a sound that was related to a laugh. We stood there for a time. You understand what the cost is, he said. Not a question. Yes, I said. Tell me what you think it is, he said. I looked at the dark outside. It does not stop, I said. The choosing. Once it is what you are, you cannot suspend it. You perceive the gap and the calculation runs, and you move toward it, because that is what the calculation produces. And the calculation does not consult you about whether you are tired. Kareth said nothing. Eventually I said, you find a gap that is a final one. He was quiet for a long time. The 3 Terrans I mentioned having worked alongside, he said, I told you one reached advanced age. I did not tell you about the other 2. No, I said, you did not. One of them, he said, was the better field operator. Between that one and the one who reached age, everything your civilization produces, the choosing, the trajectory toward danger, the classification failure that stalls the things attempting to hunt you, that one carried it at a higher intensity than I have observed in any other organism I have worked beside. He stopped. The stars outside continued doing what stars do, burning at distances that made the word distance insufficient. He could not stop finding the gaps, Kara said. Every engagement, always in range, always moving. It was what made him exceptional. It was also what he could not set down. What happened? I said. He found a gap that required him to hold a single position in an active containment zone for 13 minutes, so that 5 of my team could reach a clear exit. He held it. He set it flat. The flatness of a fact that has been carried long enough to stop being sharp and has become something heavier than sharp. Something smooth and permanent. My 5 people reached the exit, he said. I looked at the dark. What was his name? I asked. Kareth said a name. Simple, short, a Terra name that did not demand much from whatever spoke it. I did not know him. I said so. He was before your time, Kareth said. By 11 years. 11 years ago, I was 22, living in the post-collapse sectors, learning which corridors had secondary exits and which T kept you alert long enough to reach the next cycle, learning the habits that shaped whatever I was when I entered Kareth's intake corridor. Different path, similar direction. I am not telling you this to unsettle you, Kareth said. I know, I said. I am telling you because you said the calculation does not consult you about whether you are tired. That is accurate, but it is permissible, allowable to rest before you move, to remain on the ledge and count fully before you commit. I looked at him. The one who reached advanced age. I said, what did she do differently? He considered the question with the attention. He gave the questions he intended to answer honestly. She counted, he said. She moved toward the gaps. She advanced when advancing was correct. She also learned when to remain on the ledge and allow the count to develop fully before she came off it. He turned and looked at me for the first time since I had entered. She counted to 43 sometimes, he said. The thing that might have taken her ran out of patience at 41. I sat with that for a long time. The dark outside was full of the distances between things, the intervals between stars, between systems, between one side of basin and an impact site 230 meters away. The dark was where the gaps lived. I had been moving toward gaps for as long as I could clearly recall. I retrieved the alloy piece from my pocket and held it on my open palm, dark gray, thumb length, for years of handling worn into its surface. Old stress fracturing along one edge where something had struck it with sufficient force to change its geometry without destroying it. I had retrieved it on the 9th day, 14 adults, 6 juveniles, 9 days in a sector the fleet files cataloged as a breeding cluster during active cycle. Every one of those 9 days had contained gaps. The calculation had found everyone, and I had moved toward everyone, because the alternative was a thing I did not examine directly. I had come out not because I was the most capable thing in that sector, not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most sensorially equipped, not because some quality had been granted to my civilization in recognition of some earned standing, because I had counted, because I had moved toward the gaps, because the things that should have stopped me had needed 42 seconds to run their classification, and I had not given them 43, and because I had apparently, without ever consciously naming it as a strategy, been taking 43 seconds sometimes, without knowing I was doing it. Held a thing. I said aloud to no one in particular, to the dark. Kareth heard me. Yes, he said. We stood there a while longer. The station around us was quiet at that hour. Below us somewhere, the training deck held the empty assessment circuit. The medical bay was lit. The formal hall where Kareth had placed a marker in my palm was dark. I returned the alloy to my pocket. I capped my flask and turned toward the access panel. Get some rest, Kareth said. I will, I said. I walked back through the station's corridors, past the training deck and the circuit I had run every morning, past the medical bay, past the hall where Valen had stood before the cadet row, and looked past my right shoulder at something she found more worth addressing than my face. In my quarters, I set the flask on the surface beside the viewport. The equipment bay below was still. The structural strut at the far end held nothing along its length tonight. No small shape pressed against the conduit. No observation from the dark. Just a strut, just a bay, just a night cycle doing what night cycles do. I sat on the edge of the bunk and held the alloy piece in my palm. I had been carrying it for 4 years. For years since the 9th day. For years since the moment I had bent down in a sector the galaxy had not designed for me to leave and retrieved a small piece of stress-fractured gray alloy for a reason I could not have articulated at the time and still could not articulate now with any real precision. I thought about setting it down. I turned it over once more. Then I put it in my pocket. Not yet. Not every weight needs to be set down the moment you earn the standing to. Some things you carry until the carrying has finished telling you what it was for. I was not certain mine had finished yet. I lay back and looked at the plain alloy ceiling. Same ceiling it had been since I arrived. Same material, same quarters. Nothing about it had changed. I had changed. The ceiling had not noticed and did not need to. Tomorrow the evaluation cycle continued. New terrain, new targets, new variables I had not yet encountered, new gaps the calculation would find and point me toward. I would count before I moved. I would count completely. I would take 43 seconds when 43 was correct. And when moving was correct, I would move. That was sufficient. That had always been sufficient. I closed my eyes. The dark outside was full of things that did not yet understand what I was. I was at ease with that. I had always been at ease with that. It was, after all, where I did my best work.